George Washington and so forth, they comment on how much of the landscape at that time, which has now all been changed, showed the signs of great cataclysms. But we have, for instance, on the Appalachians, some of the richest coal fields around, which is basically all of the vegetation from the Rockies across the plains that were just slammed into that particular area, ground up into a fine carnivorous mass and made into coal.
What pushed it? Water?
Looks that way. That's the supposition that Patrick Garrell has, because here's the idea.
Or if we don't have water, excuse me, just the actual shifting of the crust could cause that too.
Not that distance, it's thought.
That's a long haul, okay.
There's long run-out slides where it's just merely a slide effect that occurs, and they've measured some of these in Canada. And they go considerable distances, but they don't go hundreds of miles. They might go 30 miles at the most.
Okay.
So, no, it looks as though it was a water effect. The issue, too, is that the badlands here in the U.S. have been scrubbed out by water in the eastern half of the Washington State and Oregon. You also show effects of large water runoff causing land sculpting effects and so on. So something caused that. We can postulate any number of things, but it now becomes evident that within this particular kind of a theory of a recurring cataclysm that involves this particular kind of emotion, this would be expected routinely. And basically what happens is, as the equatorial bulge shifts, 13 miles of water gets displaced and has to go somewhere. And so it sort of starts trying to crawl up out of the ocean beds over the continents just as they get filled up. And so rises to some considerable height, and then, as the planet is attempting to reestablish its spin, bear in mind there's this fundamental law called the law of the conservation of angular momentum, and you can basically it's exhibited every time anybody throws a baseball. The speed at which it leaves your hand is due to the angular momentum of the arc of the pitcher's arm, and so it's that arc that creates that level of speed, and that's what we're going to encounter here. And as that angular momentum attempts to reassert itself, the oceans slosh around a bit and go walkabout over the continent.
Slosh a bit? Okay. How big of a bit are you talking about?
There's the rub. Okay, this is something that is unknown. There's a great deal of, and I'm not through my research on it yet, so I haven't really formed serious conclusions on it, but I was educated as an oceanographer in the physical components of oceanography. And I'm familiar with waveforms and all this kind of stuff. And I would dispute that the idea that you could get a 1.5 mile high level of water under the conditions that Garrell states that may be possible, but even his work notes that the ancient history of all of this, from the people that used to be Atlanteans that ended up becoming the Egyptians, they wrote about it, as well as the Hindus. And there's another thing that reinforces my opinion of Garrell. He never got into the Hindu myths or the Taoist or any of that, and that's my area of expertise. I've been reading that stuff for years, decades.
And so that dovetails.
That dovetails, exactly. I mean, just to the same level of precision on the numbers, they're encoded in there in the whole deal.
Well, if water, I don't mean to jump all over this, but if water were sloshing and surging over most of the land masses, half a mile, whatever, they would obviously scrub clean the surface of nuclear power plants, 103 here in this country and all the rest. Wouldn't it tend to turn the oceans when they resided back from whence they came into rather ugly soup for a while?
There's probably going to be that, but then there's also other issues. Maybe long before that, that is to say maybe months before that, devastating earthquakes may make all the nuke plants melt down. And we may find ourselves in a horrid nuclear environment long before this occurs.
Sure.
There's a whole lot of predictable precursors that should exist if this theory is correct, and we're actually seeing some of those precursors now.
What you described of South America, rather South Africa, is very interesting. I didn't know that. It's a huge trench.
Yes, actually in northern Africa near Ethiopia.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a whole new ocean that's being formed, and they know that Africa is splitting. Well, again, part of the effect of all of this has got to be that it's a predictable level of impact is not only things like the level of fertility going down, but a level of chaos, for instance, must exist within the magnetic structure of each and every one of the planets that can exhibit itself in a number of different ways, some of which will be extremely deep earthquakes, alterations in tectonic plates as the inner core of the Earth gets magnetically twisted all around, very similar to the Sun.
Very interesting. All right, back in a couple minutes to talk more about this with Cliff. Glad you're along tonight. Let's get right back to our conversation with Cliff. You know, when we talk about the seed bank, we talk about Google digitizing books, and the one question which has always bothered me, although I think I've got a fairly good idea why, the continuing rape and degradation and destruction of our home, our planet. Why? Not one international globalist corporation, not one major government on the world is making any serious effort to reverse the looting, the destruction of our home. Not happening.
It does not make any sense.
No,
we
it's
have
not
not organized ourselves appropriately.
No, why kill the golden goose?
Right.
Okay, does this suggest that at some level, not all CEOs, not all somebody knows somewhere that this something very big and very unpleasant is going to happen, so what the hell difference does it matter? That's what they're saying. I don't know. Now, the other issue is Denver. Right in the center, 2.5 hours either way from coast to coast, something like that. DIA is supposedly linked to underground transport that probably goes under the Rockies. And there is a lot of talk, has been for many, many years, about the very large underground safe dwelling for special folk who could fly in within 2.5 hours, go into an underground transport at the airport, and be, shall we say, secure? I don't know. You got 1.5 miles of water running over you. You got mountain ranges displaced. Who knows? I don't have the answers. Even if it's localized 400-yard tsunamis running over 100 square miles, it doesn't matter. It's not going to be that simple. But isn't it 90% of the world's populace, Cliff, lives on the coast or very close to the ocean?
Yeah, within 30 miles,
yeah.
You get 85% of the planet's populace. But even beyond that, of course, you get almost all the nuclear plants. You get all of the port systems. You get all of the communication sites, and just on and on and on. So
it doesn't have to be 1.5 mile tsunami.
No. And some of the literature, some of the ancient literature that has come through, suggests that this movement is done in a series of fits and starts, little jerks. And this makes sense relative to what's actually going on and how the angular momentum of the planet would attempt to reassert itself under these conditions, and that the bulge being gone would not be a smooth, continuous process. And so even if you were going to shift a great degree, say that the continents were going to spin 3,000 kilometers, as Patrick suggests, well, even under those conditions, it might do it in 3 separate jumps. In which case, that perhaps it would be, as you say, locally devastating, which maybe it's going to come in, 100 miles, 200 miles along the coast, and we're going to have huge levels of destruction at that level. Effectively, our civilization is shot because of the...
So that would take care of it, sure.
Yeah, and really, the terrible part of this is that much of the civilization may be really at risk from the precursors long before we actually get to such an event, because bear in mind, certain things are predictable. As I was saying, the internal magnetics of the planet are going to get really weird, and so we're going to see, as a noticeable or predictable precursor to this, we would see the poles melt while the temperate zones become colder and have a lot of freezing. So it'd be kind of like a hair on a naturally occurring bald guy like myself. There's a little ring of hair around the ears. We're going to have snow around the temperate zone. It may get quite severe. At the same time that the Arctic Circle area may just be totally ice-free. This will have to do with those...
Which has happened before, we know. Yeah.
Correct. And actually, I think Charles Hapgood cites it both in Path of the Poles and the...
right, I think he does.
The maps of the ancient Sea King.
Well, there's trees, everything else down there. I mean, it was obviously green and lush and quite vibrant as a non-ice mass at one time. When and how. I want to, again, call attention to the special material for tonight's program, available through the guest box at my site, Rense.com or halfpasthuman.com. beautifully done. I don't know who did it.
Rebecca Price did all of the graphics for it. That's why we had to wait. Was basically we couldn't get my crude graphics to get anything close to the idea, so we had to get a professional involved.
Rebecca, you did a beautiful, brilliant job.
She translated all these very well. I'm very pleased. Yeah.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, and we will keep that up in a featured story, along with tonight's audio for free for a long time. I'm looking at some of these drawings again and again and just amazed. She is really gifted. That's good. Very good stuff. Okay, so we have 1,000 days, maybe less. Who knows?
The problem is that this is a predictable sequence if you have certain levels of knowledge ahead of time, which has been deprived from us. The powers that be may know it through the Vatican at all, but us as the regular humans, we don't.
Well, that's why I'm looking at Denver as a locus, and there's a lot of weirdness there, and anybody can be there in 2.5 hours, and that's all.